Leni hummed to herself happily as she freshened up after her short bathroom break. The morning hadn't started off so great, but it looked like things were getting better. There was a lot of panic as to where Lincoln went after herself and Lori heard him taking a shower. Quite early in the morning, before anyone else was awake, Leni pondered why Lincoln would be such an early bird upon waking up, though a part of her knew the answer, whatever she liked to admit it or not. Nevertheless, she put on a fox smile before getting herself ready for the morning once Lori was done. Even now the school day was going pretty well, as it could be at is. By this point in time, knowledge or rumors of what happened to Lincoln became effectively left in the wind, especially how few could ascertain exact details. Only a few people knew, but this information wasn't disclosed or much of the student boy. That still wasn't any stop of any of Leni's friends from breaking ties with her, which only made things worse for the fashionist, being targeted for those who were jealous of her skills of fabric designing. It may have not been as bad as the hazing Lori endured, but Leni could attest that being treated like she was a mental patient was arguably worse. If not by random people in her class, it was very prominent to her former friends. Looking back at her reflection, as she washed her hands, Leni nearly dropped her smile. Knowing that things still looked a tad bleak, as if it read on her mind, Leni's own reflection dropped the act and gave the real frown she ought to be showing. "What are you smiling for? You know there's hardly anything to be happy about." Leni then bit her cheek, still refusing to frown. "I know, but our family's still sad. Linky still thinks we're bad sisters, and all of her friends left us." "But he came back after 2 months. Isn't that a real reason to be happy?" Her reflection only shook her head. "Not when he's still afraid or mad or..." She planted her hands against the sides and stomped on the ground. "I don't know, but he still doesn't trust us. Remember what happened on chore day? How long do you think it will take for him to get over this?" The real Leni finally dropped her smile for a moment, then looking back at the sink. "I don't know." She let out a warm water pour into her hands for a moment before adding, "But it's better than staying sad all the time. It takes more muscles to frown than to smile." She then turned the faucet off. "And maybe, if I try to be happy, then everyone else could be too, right?" Then when she looked back at the mirror, her own reflection was copying her every move once again. Leni's shoulders sank before leaning towards the mirror, pulling one of the lower eyelids down to see if there was anything abnormal in her sight. Aside from the few casually unexposed arteries, her eye was as white as it could be. "Maybe I am going crazy," the fashionist sighed dejectfully as she stood up straight, grabbing a few paper towels out of the container to dry her hands. She tossed them into the trash on her way out. "I hope this isn't a side effect from my medicine." Since it was a study hall period, Leni didn't need to be in a specific class to speak. However, she often spent her time in the library. Since it was quiet and weeks before, it was one of the few places no one bothered her. Sometimes she might even find Luna hanging around, which itself was unusual due to her loud nature. As for Leni, turned to the hallway, the library was located. Her eyes widened as she stopped at her tracks. Towards the right side of the hall, 20 feet away from her, was 2 of her former friends, Becky and Mandy. Leni often had to remind herself technically weren't her friends anymore after they started avoiding her like she had cooties. Every time she tried to approach them, they fidgeted on the spot before making up an excuse that they needed to be elsewhere. Unlike her other sisters, Leni didn't catch on to open hostility due to her radiating with kindness. At least she was considered to be lucky at the end. Still, she brought the excuse up a couple of weeks after she admitted her fault in the whole ordeal, only to realize that they only simply just didn't want to be in her presence. Since then, Leni didn't approach or even acknowledge her old friends, preferably keeping to herself, no matter how little comfortable solitude provided her. But that was a long time ago, Leni told herself, suddenly grabbing one of her arms for support. Maybe they could have forgotten by then? I mean, no one has brought it up about it for a month or so. Leni clutched her free hand into a fist as a wave of determination flushed through her. Her brows tilted a little, giving the expression that she was irate, but it really wasn't. I'm tired of being alone. She dropped her arm to the side, walking at a smooth pace towards the two girls. If Lincoln can manage to come back to us, then I should be able to handle this. So Leni drew closer to the duo. The conversation they were having reached her ears. So I told him that he didn't need to rush me on deciding what he wanted to do, because we got another year left. Plus, nobody's going to go to college immediately after high school, Becky stated, a hand firmly placed on her hip. It isn't the pressure from his parents? Mandy asked, shifting much of her weight on one leg, because mine wanted me to go on as soon as I graduate, and I still haven't even decided on a major yet. Becky could only shrug. Tad says no, but the way he implies it's something along those lines. Hey, girls! The enthusiastic voice cut into their chatter. Both girls turned to see Leni, with her typical smile on her face, her frown having to be pocketed for the time being. So, the loud put her hands on her back. How are things? Hey. Becky gave an awkward smile while accompanied by a shy wave. Girl, we haven't seen you in over a month. We thought you might have changed schools or something. Mandy spoke with a surprised yet blunt tone, with a subdued hint of edginess. Leni pretended she didn't hear that. Of course not. I was just... She paused, wondering how to explain what she was up to, without sounding like a drag. Busy with stuff. But I've got nothing to do after school, so I was wondering, if we can hang out. Catch up. Sounds great. Becky darted, placing her hands behind her back. But I gotta do, her eyes shifted a little, thing this afternoon. Leni's smile started to drop. Like what? I gotta feed my cat? The redhead replied in an enthusiastic tone over. Mandy shrugged. Gonna be busy with homework. At this point, Leni dropped her smile entirely, replaced with a curt frown. Her head tilted down as she had temporarily gazed over the tile floor. Her would have fallen for her those fibs, but the current Leni wasn't going to be tricked by any more bullshit. You're both lying. Her voice was barely above whisper. The thin redhead raised an eyebrow. I'm sorry. What? All the weeks Leni spent alone, getting picked on, almost feeling like she didn't exist to the people that cared about her outside her own family, was starting to pour out in a torrent of aggression. The blonde could barely contain herself, her hands clutched tight, while her body shook suddenly as the dam started to burst. I say you're both liars! The fashionist glared hatedly at the two of them, making the two women flinch, while unconsciously taking a step backwards. Becky, she pointed out, the pretty girl making her in a freezing place. You don't own a cat, especially after you found out you were allergic to them back in middle school, and your sister was adopted a puppy 2 years ago. Shifting her gaze over towards the finger to Mandy. And Mandy, you always do your homework early, and you've got nothing to do at home. She brought up her hand back to her side. And you guys have used the same excuse before. I even started avoiding you on purpose. Becky and Mandy's eyes widened at the bout of information that just came out from Leni, as she breathed like she ran a marathon. Normally she would be forgetful at the simplest tasks, which sometimes made her working on a project with her difficult. Not to mention that there was one time Leni actually told the story of how she set the chickens free at a grocery store. The cooked ones from the portable oven? Sure, everyone could at least that Leni was a genius in fashion, but not so much as everything else. It was a wonder of how she managed to keep up with her class without needing special ed. In all the bubbly acts everyone had witnessed from the kind loud, no one expected Leni to act, well, not the dumb blonde she painted herself to be, not to mention angry. Leni breathed through her nose and released a heated sigh. Look, I get it. She then stood up straight. You guys still don't like me after what I told you what had happened to Lincoln. Folding her arms. But it's been 2 months. You think I've had an easy time knowing my own brother probably isn't going to forgive me? I can't even be in the same building as him without Lincoln freaking out. A pregnant pause filled the void as Leni let her remaining anger silently burn itself out. Look, I'm not saying that I deserve to give the cold shoulder, but you could have at least asked if I was doing okay, instead of trying to avoid me and pretend I didn't exist. But we didn't, Becky started. I saw the looks you both given me after almost 4 weeks went by, Leni interrupted, narrowing her eyes at the redhead. Everyone else who has been heard of it or started some weird rumor that just got forgot after a few days, a week at most. Even my older sister is starting to talk with Carol, and she doesn't even like her. Leni bit her cheek. For reasons you never really talked about. Mandy sighed. Okay, Leni, you got us. Yes, we've been avoiding you, but how can you expect us not to? You literally came up one day and told us one of your other sisters got into a fight with your brother, wound up sending him to the hospital. The brunette tapped her foot. How does someone like you, who is always carefree and love making others smile so much that you're practically just a goddamn saint, end up doing something like that? Leni started, the unnerving feeling of her eyes becoming wet dominating her actions for a moment. I don't know. I was mad at Lori over the dress thing, and with everyone else arguing about other stuff, then Lincoln tries to help. But it just got worse and... She sniffled back as she dried her own eye. A pregnant pause filled the void as Leni took the time to gather herself. We took the love and trust that he had for us, and I don't know how to get it back. A twinge of sadness filled Mandy's chest as she watched a loud teeter on the edge of breaking down. But it wasn't enough to let her start being overly compassionate. Well, he has at least thought about forgiving you? Leni's only visible eye shifted his gaze towards the floor. She really hoped Lincoln had at least considered it. But given that she had no contact from him except for last night. He only came back yesterday, after staying at his friend's house for a month. Leni brought her hand back to her side, despite more tears starting to well up on her lids. But since he did, he might be? Becky squinted her eye in confusion. Why was he staying at a friend's place? It's a long story, Leni answered, not willing to add any more details. Mandy folded her arms. Okay, let me put it like this. It's good that you feel bad about what happened and all, but it doesn't mean that things are going to get better knowing what you did. She approached Leni and placed a hand on her shoulder. Leni, you're probably the most selfless girl I've met since elementary school. A lot of girls tend to act nice, but really they're nasty underneath the surface. But you aren't like them, though. You're sweet, though, and through. That's why it's just uncomfortable being around you right now. I mean, no offense, but when you first told me about it, I wondered if you were only pretending to be dense most of the time. Becky shifted her stance a little. Or secretly crazy like those psychos in movies. Leni then gave a frown of disapproval, to which Mandy immediately removed her hand. I'm not stupid, you know. Both Mandy and Becky gave her blank stares and said otherwise. Okay. She shook her hands defensively. But those times I acted like a 2-year-old only because I didn't take the medicine I need to help me focus. Becky's eyes widened. You take pills? Leni, to her embarrassment, nodded. I have AD something. I don't really know what it is, but I've been taking stuff over the weeks so I can feel like more my actual age instead of being, well, the other me. Feeling like this was a little too insensitive. Back to my point, Mandy cut in, before anyone else could speak. You're a sweet person, Leni, but we're probably just not ready to be around you yet. Maybe sometime later we can hang out. Maybe when your brother forgives you for what happened. Whichever comes first, but right now, the preppy teen mulled over at her words. It's just hard to hang around someone who has to hurt their younger sibling so bad. If I ended up doing that to my little sister, I'd probably kill myself, Becky stated flatly, making the other two girls look at her weirdly. What am I just saying? She might think I'm just better if I wasn't around? The redheaded shrugged. A little too creepy there, Beck, Mandy stated, shuddering a little, turning back to Leni. I'm sorry we've been avoiding you, but I hope you understand why. I guess, Leni spoke in a hushed tone. She blinked once, fresh tears trailing down her cheeks. Well, see you around, I guess, Mandy responded, backing away from the distraught Loud. As much as she wanted to comfort the poor girl, there was still a part of her that settled in with the idea that Leni wasn't exactly the best person to be around with. Mandy then turned to her heels before walking away. Becky looked after her, her back turned to Leni for a moment, but didn't say a word as she felt as if it were best to make her exit. Leni didn't say anything as her lips started to quiver, her vision becoming blurry as her eyes burned from the tears they produced. But I don't know if Lincoln will ever forgive me, Leni mulled to herself. as many times as fun times the trio had. It was all clear it was just for one lapse of judgment from those people whom you thought you were close to. It wasn't until those two women were out of the sight and did damn finally burst. Leni's shoulders quaked as silent choked sobs escaped her, making soft noises, otherwise silent halls. She breathed in loudly before another wail, only barely louder than the first, vibrated through her as she brought her hands to her face. Streaks of tears leaked through her gasp of fingers at the sides of her mind, dripping down to the floor on the effect of the miniature shower. Some drops had black tint to them, meaning the fashionist makeup had started to become runny. I wish I never bought that stupid dress, Leni screamed out, her voice reeking with dejection and sorrow. Some 10 feet away, a fat, stout teenager came out from the boys' bathroom. A roll of toilet paper stuck to the bottom of his left shoe. Phew! I think I lost 20 pounds in there. He poked his gut, with its shrink digits sinking to his shirt by half an inch. I really got to cut back on the pizzas at work. As the boy was being distracted by the distant sound of another human adolescent crying, taking his mind off his stomach, the teen then looked up to see Leni standing off to the side in the hall. A few puddles of tears were now at her feet. The boy winced as he listened for the crying loud to make a nasally sniffle, promptly going back to the bathroom for a few seconds. Leni pulled her hands away from her face, revealing long black lines of mascara that ran down from her cheeks from her eyes. Her eyes themselves were red from the moment of anguish, and her nose felt a little runny. Her eyes widened to surprise when a couple of paper towels were suddenly suspended just inches from her face. You okay, dude? Leni blinked twice, before gingerly taking the hand towels. No. She dabbed the part of her face, frowning in disgust as she realized how much mascara had been ruined. But thanks. Looking down at the pudgy teen, who was silently shorter than her, her reddish eyes narrowed a little. Who are you again? I think I might have seen you before. It's Chaz, the curly-haired teen introduced himself, lifting his cap off his head for a second, before sending it back on his due. I think he used to shop at the store I worked at every weekend. Tapping his chin, he jogged at his memory. Leni, right? Yeah, the loud replied, still trying to get over the stinging sensation of her eyes. As she looked down, she noticed a line of toilet paper on the floor. Curiosity got the better of her as she idly traced the line back to its source. Her eyes brightened a little when she saw it was attached to the bottom of Chaz's shoe. She bit her cheek and a few giggles churned to a throat, coming out from the suppressed chortle. Chaz raised an eyebrow. What's so funny? There's toilet paper on your shoe. Leni answered with a short giggle. Chaz looked down and lifted one of his shoes, gave a half-idle groan as it escaped him. Aw, man, he muttered. He immediately started to wipe it off the floor, prompting Leni to cover her mouth as she tried to hold in her laughter. 2 periods later would finally give in too much of a needed lunch break. As students crowded the cafeteria for whatever food they wanted to at least edible, for a certain former sports star exited out of the pair of side doors, her bag lunch clutched tightly in her hand, as if Lynn wanted to eat that gross cafeteria food. Walking towards the playground, Lynn was expecting to be eaten solo today. Margot said she had a dentist appointment around noon and likely wouldn't be back for the rest of the day. Clever girl at that one, but it wasn't like Lynn had no reason to be eaten by herself, and she was less focused on her lunch due to yesterday's events. Still, she couldn't wrap her head around why Lincoln chose to sit close to him at dinner time. He could have been pretty distant after their shared appointment with Dr. Lopez, which obvious given how irate he had become when he was dropped off at Clyde's house. Lynn also knew that she wouldn't have even a chance in offering her housewarming present if Lily hadn't intervened. She owed the baby a nice round of cuddles after that. Heh, Lynn smiled. Just a moment ago, she'd thrown the whole kitchen at me and blew raspberries nonstop. And now Lily's helping me get through Lincoln way better I would have been on my own. Looking up at the clouds. Time really flies. At least Lily isn't that spiteful enough to hate us forever. Lynn tilted her head back down, focused on the tree she usually sits at. I guess all those small approaches to Link is finally making him realize I'm not trying to hide anything from him. I mean, I got everything out at the almost open after the last talk we had. She shrugged to herself, although the brunette started to frown. He was more tense than I am at practicing during dinner. Not surprising since he had been near all of us in 2 months. He hasn't been. Lyndon raised a brow. But what's with me sitting him? She then stopped and looked at the tree, sat down in the shade, pausing for a moment to enjoy the warm breeze that brushed her past face. Does that mean he's starting to trust me more? Lynn shook her head after that very thought. Nah, he probably would have asked me to walk with him to school this morning if he wanted to ditch everyone else. I doubt he let me sit near him during lunch anyway. Lynn opened up her bag, taking out a container of last night's leftovers. Normally there wouldn't be with all 13 members eating, as opposed of some here and there, Lincoln's absence. However, it seemed like the middle child hadn't eaten as much as Lynn Sr. would have hoped. Well, let's hope no food was wasted in that house, unless it was one of Luann's pranks. Digging out the fork that she had from home, Lynn popped the container, revealing some Salisbury steak mixed in with dirty rice and vegetables. Sitting up at the top of the back of the bag, she stabbed the fork into the meat and devoured it. Seconds later, it was still warm, seeing that Lynn only had time to heat it up in the morning before leaving the house. But she didn't mind. As for Lynn was about to stick another piece in her mouth. Lynn? The former athlete flinched, nearly dropping her fork in the grass, but caught it at the moment. She glanced up at the person who called her, only to do a double take to make sure she wasn't just imagining things. Lincoln stood 7 feet from her, with his own bagged lunch in hand, held tightly to his side. Can I sit with you? He then tried to speak evenly as possible, but the boy wouldn't hide his nervousness from Lynn. The brunette also noticed how fidgety his legs were, always jerking slightly, even for a few seconds. A bead of sweat had formed on her face from the back of her head. Welp, there goes my appetite.